Christmas Eve. A woman sets divorce papers on a marble counter and beside them, a positive pregnancy test. No note, no goodbye. Just the quiet devastation of two things that should never exist in the same sentence. She picks up her suitcase, walks through a mansion worth more than most people's entire lives, and never looks back. The man she's leaving is not just her husband. He is the most feared criminal in South Korea, and he has no idea she's already gone. This is the story of what happens when the coldest man alive realizes too late what he's about to lose. If this story hits you somewhere deep, hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Now stay with me, because this one doesn't let go. Wow. The divorce papers had been notarized on a Thursday. Nia Okafor had driven herself to the notary's office in Gangnam, parked the car herself, sat in a plastic chair in a waiting room that smelled like printer toner and recycled air, and signed her name in 4 separate places while a bored government clerk watched without expression. She'd worn sunglasses the entire time, not because she was crying, but because she hadn't slept in 3 days and her eyes looked like something that had given up. She'd driven herself home. She'd made herself tea. She'd folded the papers into a manila envelope and slid them beneath a stack of art catalogs on her desk, where they stayed for 11 days while she figured out whether she actually had the nerve to go through with it. She did. It turned out nerve had very little to do with it. What she had instead was exhaustion, a specific bone-deep kind of exhaustion that has nothing to do with sleep and everything to do with years of waiting for a man to look at you the way he used to, and slowly understanding that the man who used to look at you that way no longer exists, and maybe never did. She'd love Kang Min-jae the way you love something dangerous without fully understanding why. She'd met him in New York, at an auction preview for a private collection, Korean ceramics from the Goryeo dynasty, pieces so old and so precise they looked less like objects and more like arguments. He'd been standing in front of a celadon vase the color of sea ice, and he hadn't been looking at the vase. He'd been looking at her. Not the way men looked at her when they wanted something. The way a person looks at something that surprises them. He'd said in English that was careful and almost without accent, "You're the only other person in this room who actually knows what they're looking at." She'd said, "You're not looking at the vase." He'd almost smiled. Almost. That was 3 years ago. She'd married him 8 months later in a ceremony in Seoul that she'd spent weeks telling herself was exactly what she wanted. She'd curated a life in South Korea, built a professional network, learned enough Korean to navigate the city on her own, and spent 2 years slowly realizing that the man she had married was disappearing behind something she couldn't name and wasn't allowed to ask about. He was never cruel to her. That was the thing nobody would believe if she tried to explain it. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten her. He was cold the way winter is cold. Not hostile, just indifferent to whether you were warm or not. He worked. He disappeared. He came home at hours that made no sense and offered no explanations. He sat across from her at dinner and answered her questions with single sentences, and she learned, slowly, to stop asking. She tried. That part mattered to her. She needed to be honest with herself about the fact that she had tried. She'd planned weekends that he canceled. She'd left notes he acknowledged without reading aloud. She'd suggested counseling once, in a voice so carefully neutral she barely recognized it as her own. And he'd looked at her the way you look at someone who has just said something in a language you don't speak. The pregnancy had not been planned. She'd found out on a Tuesday morning 6 weeks ago, sitting on the cold tile of their ensuite bathroom with a test strip in both hands, and her first thought, the very first thing that moved through her before anything else, was not joy and not terror. It was, he is not going to know how to do this. Her second thought, following immediately behind the first, was, and neither are you, if you stay. She'd made the decision quietly, the way she made most of her real decisions. Not with drama, not with a scene. She'd booked a one-way flight to London. She had a standing offer from the Tate Modern's acquisitions team, a job she'd deferred twice already. And she'd spent the following weeks quietly dismantling her life in Seoul. Shipping boxes, closing accounts, calling her mother once and not telling her anything except that she was coming home. The only thing left was the envelope. She placed it on the marble kitchen counter at 10:47 on Christmas Eve, in the kitchen of a house that had cost 11 million American dollars and felt, on most mornings, like a very beautiful prison. She set the divorce papers flat on the counter, and she set the pregnancy test on top of them. Not as cruelty, not exactly, but because she could not disappear without leaving him the truth. He'd denied her so many truths. She would not do the same to him, even now. She picked up her carry-on. She looked around the kitchen. The custom cabinetry, the imported stone, the high windows that caught the light a certain way in the late afternoon and made everything look like a painting she had no claim to. And she left. The car she'd called was waiting at the gate. The driver didn't speak. She sat in the back seat with her hands folded in her lap and watched Seoul move past the window. The lit-up streets, the Christmas decorations that felt borrowed from somewhere else. The city going about its business on a cold December night with total indifference to the fact that her life was ending and beginning at the same time. Incheon International Airport was its own particular kind of chaos at the holidays. She moved through it efficiently, the way she moved through most things, with her chin up and her face composed and her interior state locked behind a door that she alone had the key to. She checked in. She cleared security. She found her gate and sat down and bought an overpriced coffee she didn't finish and stared at the departure board. London, 1:30, gate 34, boarding in 90 minutes. She put her earbuds in and did not think about Min Jae. She was reasonably successful at this for approximately 45 minutes. Kang Min Jae came home at 11:15. He'd been at a meeting that ran 4 hours over schedule, a meeting he could not have described to his wife in any detail because his wife did not know the specifics of what he did, and he had worked very hard for 3 years to ensure that she never would. He was tired in the way that men who carry secrets are tired, not in the muscles, but somewhere behind the eyes. He drove himself. He always drove himself when he needed to think, and he had needed to think for the entire length of the Han River Bridge. The house was dark. This was not unusual. Nia kept her own hours. She was often in her study late, working, surrounded by catalogs and correspondence, and the particular organized chaos of a woman who was brilliant at her job and knew it. He'd learned not to disturb her. He'd learned, or told himself he'd learned, that her self-sufficiency was something to respect rather than something that should have alarmed him. He set his keys on the entryway table. He loosened his tie. He walked to the kitchen because he hadn't eaten since 2 in the afternoon, and he was thinking about whether there was anything in the refrigerator worth standing upright for. And he turned on the kitchen light, and he saw the envelope on the counter. He saw it the way you see something that your brain processes before your eyes do. The shape of it, the placement, the stillness of it in an empty house. Something in the room had changed the temperature. He stood in the kitchen doorway for 3 full seconds without moving. Then he walked to the counter. He picked up the pregnancy test first because it was on top. He looked at it for a long time, the kind of looking that isn't really seeing. It's the brain running the same information through every available filter, trying to find the interpretation that makes sense. There was only one interpretation. He set it down carefully, the way you set something down when you're afraid of what you might do if you're not careful, and he opened the envelope. He read the first page. He read it again. He turned to the second page and read that too, and then he put the papers down flat on the counter and stood there with both hands braced against the marble and breathed through his nose. The divorce papers were dated. He looked at the date. 11 days ago. She had been in this house for 11 days after signing these papers. She had sat across from him at dinner. She had said good morning. She had moved through the rooms of their shared life and said nothing, and he who prided himself on reading every room he walked into, who had survived for a decade in a world where missing something could get you killed, had read nothing. He picked up his phone and called her. It rang 6 times and went to voicemail. He called again. Voicemail. He stood very still for a moment that lasted somewhere between 5 seconds and the rest of his life. Then he looked at the pregnancy test again. Then he walked out of the kitchen, picked up his keys from the entryway table, and drove to Incheon. He drove the way he did everything when he was operating on something close to panic, which was quietly, precisely, and very fast. He did not allow himself to think in complete sentences because complete sentences would require him to look directly at what was happening, and he could not do that and drive at the same time. He drove on instinct and muscle memory and a specific kind of dread that he had not felt since he was 19 years old and standing in a hospital corridor waiting to hear whether a man who had meant something to him was going to survive the night. That man had not survived. He was not going to let history repeat itself on a different axis. He parked illegally in the departures zone at Incheon and did not care. He walked through the main terminal doors at 12:47 in the morning, still in his suit, still in his tie, with the divorce papers folded in his jacket pocket and the pregnancy test in his hand because he had picked it up without thinking and hadn't put it down. The terminal was full. Holiday travel, families, couples, exhausted children in airport strollers, and he moved through it like a current through water. Not pushing, just moving, scanning. He found her at gate 34. She was sitting in the second row from the window, facing the tarmac, earbuds in, her carry-on tucked under the seat in front of her. She was wearing a dark coat he recognized. She'd bought it in Paris 18 months ago, at a market she'd gone to alone while he was in a meeting that he'd told her was a business dinner. She was looking at her phone with the particular focused blankness of someone who is not looking at anything. He stopped about 6 feet away. He stood there long enough that the people around her started to notice him before she did. A young woman 2 seats over looked up, then away, then back. A man near the window shifted slightly. Min-jae was aware, in the distant way of a man who had long since accepted that he inhabited a particular kind of space, that he was not someone people looked away from easily. He was also aware that he was standing in an airport gate at midnight holding a pregnancy test, and that he had perhaps not thought this through. Nia looked up. She saw him immediately. He watched the sequence of expressions move across her face, shock, then something that was not quite relief but was structured like it, then a hardening that he recognized as the thing she did when she was deciding how much of herself to show. She pulled out one earbud. She didn't say anything. He took the last few steps. He stopped in front of her, close enough that they were in the particular acoustic bubble of a shared conversation, and he looked at her. Her face, her hands in her lap, the way she was sitting like someone who was ready for something to be over. Nia. Min-jae. Her voice was level. Her voice was always level. It was one of the things he'd loved about her and one of the things that had, over time, begun to frighten him. The smoothness of her composure. The possibility that she had already processed everything that needed processing and arrived at conclusions he was only now seeing for the first time. He didn't know how to start. He had driven 40 minutes in a straight line of near panic and had not, it turned out, used any of that time to figure out what to say. He was a man who was very good at saying exactly the right thing in a room full of dangerous people, and he was standing in front of his wife and he had nothing. He held up the pregnancy test. Her eyes dropped to it, then came back to his face. "I found it," he said. "I know you did," she said. "That's why I left it." The flight board's in 30 minutes. She said it without moving, not as a threat, just a fact, a wall made of information. "I'm not asking you to stay in Seoul." He said it before he knew he was going to say it, and he realized as he said it that it was true. "I'm asking you to give me 2 weeks." Something moved in her face, gone before he could name it. 2 weeks, she repeated, "before you get on that plane, before you go to London. 2 weeks. If I can't—" He stopped. He looked at her. He was acutely aware of the people around them. A family to his left pretending not to listen. The gate agent behind the desk who had looked up twice. He didn't care about any of them. "Give me 2 weeks to show you that I know what I did, that I know what I cost us." "Min-jae?" Her voice had a quality in it that he hadn't heard before. Not anger, not even sadness. Something older. "Do you actually know, or do you know that I'm leaving and you're scared?" It was the most honest question anyone had ever asked him in his adult life. He stood there with it. "Both," he said. "I think both are true." She looked at him for a long time. The departure board behind his head flickered. Flight status updating. He didn't turn to look. 2 weeks, she said finally. "You have 2 weeks, and you stay out of my room, out of my space, and you tell me the truth. All of it. Whatever you've been hiding for 2 years, all of it. Yes. I mean it, everything." "I know." She looked at him for another moment. The gate agent's voice came over the intercom. "First boarding call for London Heathrow, premium cabin passengers." And Nia looked toward the desk and then back at him, and he watched her make a decision that he was terrified to witness and terrified to look away from. She reached down and picked up her carry-on. For 1 second, he thought she was going to board the plane anyway. He thought he had driven across Seoul at midnight and stood in an airport holding a pregnancy test like some kind of last act, and she was going to board the plane anyway, and that would have been a reasonable thing for her to do. She put the carry-on strap over her shoulder and stood up. "Call the car," she said. He called the car. They drove back to the estate in silence, not the hostile silence of two people refusing to speak, the exhausted silence of two people who have said enough for one night and need the dark and the motion of the car to hold them before any more words come. Nia sat by the window. Minjae sat with his hands flat on his thighs. At some point the city thinned out and the road opened up, and there was nothing outside but the dark outline of winter hills and the overhead lights of the highway. And Nia turned from the window and looked at him. "There's a guest house," she said, "on the east end of the property. You haven't been in it. It has its own entrance. I'll stay there. Okay? I mean it about the space." "I know you do." She turned back to the window. He looked at the back of her head, the tight, careful coils of her hair, the line of her jaw in the dim light, and something moved through him that he did not have a name for and did not try to name. He had spent 3 years being careful. He had made decisions that were rational and strategic and designed to protect her, and every single one of them had been the wrong decision. He understood this now with the total, clarifying certainty that comes from nearly losing something. Nearly. The word sat in his chest like a coal. The car turned through the estate gates at 2 in the morning. Nia was out of the car before it had fully stopped, carry-on in hand, and he watched her walk toward the guest house without looking back. He sat in the car for a moment after the driver cut the engine, in the dark and the cold, with the divorce papers in his jacket pocket, and 2 weeks on a clock he could already feel running. He got out of the car. He stood in the driveway for a moment and looked up at the sky, clear, cold, the kind of night that has no mercy in it, and breathed. Then he went inside and sat down at the kitchen counter, still in his coat, and looked at the space where the envelope had been, and started to think about what telling the truth actually required of him. It required everything. He knew that. He had known it before he drove to the airport, before he stood in front of her, before he said 2 weeks as though 2 weeks were a number he'd chosen rather than a number she'd handed him. He had known it from the moment he picked up those papers and felt the ground under his very carefully constructed life tilt sideways. The truth would cost him the only thing he had left to lose. The truth was also the only currency she would accept. He sat there until the sky started to go gray at the edges, working through what he would say, and what order he would say it in, and how to make it land as fact rather than defense, because the last thing she needed from him right now was a man trying to justify himself. She needed a man willing to be seen without justification. He wasn't sure he'd ever been that man. He was going to have to figure out how. Outside, in the guest house, a light was still on. He could see it through the kitchen window, a pale rectangle in the gray pre-dawn, steady and small, like something refusing to go out. He didn't know what she was doing in there, probably not sleeping. Possibly sitting with the reality of what she'd agreed to, weighing it, looking for the angles the way she always did. She was methodical, Nia, underneath the composure, a woman who moved through the world like she was always doing arithmetic on things you couldn't see. Maybe she was questioning the choice she'd made at the gate. Maybe she was already regretting turning back. He would give her the space she asked for. He would cook breakfast. He would be there. He would open every locked room in himself that he had spent years boarding up, one by one, starting tomorrow, and he would hand her the key to each of them, and he would not ask her what she planned to do with what she found. 2 weeks. 14 days. Somewhere in the estate, a clock was ticking in the dark, and Minjae sat at his marble counter and listened to it, and understood for the first time in 3 years that the most dangerous thing he had ever faced was not a rival organization, not a government investigator, not a man with a gun. It was the possibility that the woman in the guest house would look at everything he truly was and decide it wasn't enough. He sat with that. He didn't look away from it. Morning came the way mornings do in winter. Reluctantly, gray at the edges, the light arriving like an apology. Minjae had not slept. He'd changed out of his suit at some point, pulled on a plain dark sweater and trousers, and by 6:30 he was in the kitchen. He'd cooked breakfast precisely once in the past 2 years that Nia could verify. A Sunday morning early in their marriage, when the housekeeper was away, and he'd made something that technically qualified as eggs. Today he stood in front of the stove and cooked properly. Rice, soup, eggs the way he'd watched her make them. Not scrambled, not the Korean way, but soft fried. the edges just crisp, the yolk intact. He set everything on a tray with a glass of water and a cup of barley tea because she'd switched from coffee when she found out about the pregnancy. He'd noticed that the subtle disappearance of the coffee ritual filed it away without fully understanding what it meant. And he carried the tray to the guest house door at 7:15. He knocked twice. Silence. He almost left the tray on the doorstep and walked away, because that was the thing he would have done 2 years ago. Leave the gesture without the presence, the thought without the follow-through, the performance of care without the actual cost of it. He made himself stand there. The door opened. Nia was wearing a gray sweatshirt and her hair was loose. Not the careful version of herself she usually presented, but the actual version, morning-faced and unslept, with the particular exhausted honesty of a person who hasn't yet put their armor on. She looked at the tray, then at him, then at the tray again. "I didn't know what you'd want," he said. "I tried to remember." She looked at him for a moment. Something in her face moved, not softening exactly, but the recognition that he had paid attention to something small, and that small things were, in the architecture of what they were trying to rebuild, structural. She took the tray. "Thank you," she said. Not warm, but not the wall either. He nodded. He turned to go. "Minjae." He stopped. "Tonight," she said. "I want to talk. Actually talk. Not dinner, not something with background noise. Just sit down and talk. Whatever you need." "I need the truth," she said. "I need you to start from the beginning and tell me what actually happened to us. Not your version that protects you, the actual thing." He turned to look at her in the doorway, the tray in her hands, the morning gray behind her, and the pale glow of the guest house light behind that. And he said, "Okay, just that." "Okay." She looked at him a beat longer. Then she stepped back inside and closed the door quietly, and he stood on the step for a moment before walking back to the main house, and the cold air sat in his lungs like a held breath, and somewhere behind the clouds the sun was beginning its slow, unconvinced ascent over the hills. He had 1 day down, 13 to go, and somewhere in the locked territory of everything he had not yet told her, there was a name that had been the beginning of everything that went wrong between them. A man who had stood in Minjae's own organization, taken his money, and pointed a threat at the one person Minjae could not afford to lose. Jung Tae-hyun. The name sat in Minjae's chest like a splinter he'd learned to breathe around. He had protected her from it for 2 years. He had burned the marriage to the ground to protect her from it. And tonight, sitting across from her in whatever room she chose, with no performance and no strategy and no way out, he was going to have to say it aloud for the first time. He walked back to the house in the gray morning light, and he thought about how a man begins to tell the truth after 2 years of careful silence, and whether the truth, once it starts moving, can be trusted to stop before it destroys everything it touches. He didn't have an answer. He had 13 days to find out. They sat across from each other in the guest house living room at 9 o'clock that night, and it was nothing like a dinner, and nothing like a conversation, and nothing like anything Minjae had prepared himself for, because preparation, he was learning, was a form of control, and control was exactly what this required him to surrender. Nia had pushed the coffee table to one side and pulled 2 chairs to face each other directly. Not angled, not softened by distance, just 2 chairs facing each other like an interrogation that both parties had agreed to. She was in the same gray sweatshirt from the morning. She had a glass of water she hadn't touched. She sat with her knees together and her hands in her lap, and she looked at him with the particular quality of attention she brought to things she was serious about, full, unblinking, the kind of attention that made most people want to look away. Minjae did not look away. He sat down. "Start from the beginning," she said. "Which beginning?" "The one you've been hiding." He breathed in slowly through his nose. The room was quiet. The guest house had a different quality of silence than the main house, smaller and more honest, the kind of silence that didn't have staff moving through it at the edges. A lamp in the corner threw a warm, inadequate light. Outside, the estate grounds were dark and cold and still. "Tae-hyun," he said. He watched her face. She didn't react to the name, which meant she didn't know it, which was exactly what he had spent 2 years engineering. "Jung Tae-hyun," he said. "He was my right hand for 6 years, longer than anyone. I trusted him in ways I don't trust most people." Okay. 14 months into our marriage, I found out he'd been skimming from the organization. Not small amounts. Over 2 years, he'd moved roughly $40 million through accounts I didn't have visibility into. By the time I found out, most of it was already gone. He said it flatly, without decoration, because the facts themselves were the point. I confronted him privately. I gave him a chance to make it right. And instead of making it right, he told me what he planned to do if I moved against him. Nia was very still. He told me he'd been watching you, Minjae said. Where you went, your routine, your driver. He told me he had people who could reach you anywhere in Seoul, and that if I touched him or his money, he would demonstrate that to me directly. The silence that followed was not the absence of sound. It was something with weight and texture, the kind of silence that fills a room the way water fills a container, completely, from the bottom up. He threatened me, Nia said. Yes, and you didn't tell me. No. She looked at him. Why? It wasn't really a question. It was the beginning of an accounting. Because telling you would have required explaining everything else, he said. What the organization was. What I was. How deep it went. I'd been careful about how much you knew. I told myself it was to protect you, and that was partly true. But it was also... He stopped. I didn't want you to know what I actually was. I knew if you knew, you'd leave. So I kept you separate from it. And then Tai Hyun used that separation as a weapon. Nia was quiet for a moment, then she said, So your solution was to push me away. My solution was to make you want to leave on your own, he said. Not because I wanted you gone. Because if you left because the marriage was cold and empty, you'd leave safely. You'd leave and go back to New York or London and be out of reach before Tae-hyun had any reason to use you against me. I was handling him in the background, so it took time. It required moving carefully, and I needed you somewhere he couldn't touch you while I did it. She picked up the glass of water, set it down without drinking. You decided all of that, she said, by yourself. Yes. Without telling me I was in danger. Yes. Without asking me what I wanted. Yes. So you froze me out of my own life, she said. You made me feel invisible and replaceable and insane for thinking something was wrong, because you decided that was safer than trusting me with the truth. He didn't argue with it. Every word was accurate. Do you understand, she said, and her voice had something in it now, not raised, not broken, but pressurized, the way a voice gets when the feeling behind it is too large for the room. What that did to me. Not just the marriage, me. I spent 2 years thinking I wasn't enough, thinking I'd imagined the person I married, thinking there was something wrong with what I was offering that made you just stop wanting it. I know. You don't get to just say I know. Then what do I say? You tell me it was wrong. Her eyes didn't leave his. Not strategically wrong, not a miscalculation, wrong. You chose to let me believe I was failing rather than tell me the truth. That was a choice you made. Say that. He held her gaze. It was wrong. It was a choice I made, and it was wrong, and there is no version of it that wasn't. Something in her face didn't soften. That wasn't the word, but it acknowledged the sentence. She looked at the floor for a moment, then back up. Where is he now? She said. Tae-hyun. Gone. I handled it 8 months ago. What does handled mean? It means he's no longer a threat to you or anyone I care about. It means the money he took is accounted for. It means he understood very clearly what the consequences of any further action would be. He paused. He's alive. He's out of South Korea. That's all I'll tell you. She studied him. Is that the only thing you've been hiding? He was quiet for 3 seconds. 3 seconds in a conversation like this one is an eternity, and they both knew it. No, he said. She waited. There's more, he said. Not tonight. Not because I'm protecting myself. Because there are pieces of it that are going to change how you see everything. And I need you to have the first piece before I put the second one on top of it. I'm asking you for one more day. She looked at him for a long time. The lamp in the corner flickered once, a small, unremarkable thing, and the room settled back into its quiet. One more day, she said, and then all of it. All of it. She stood up. He stood up too, reflexively. They were 3 feet apart, and the distance had a different quality than it had had an hour ago. Not warm, not repaired, but changed. The air between them had a charge in it that was not affection, but was adjacent to something that might, under different circumstances, become it. "Go back to the house," she said. He went. He did not sleep again. He sat at his desk in the study he rarely used, a room full of books he'd accumulated because they looked right rather than because he'd read them, and he spent 3 hours composing what he was going to say the next day. Not rehearsing it. Composing it. There was a difference. Rehearsing was about performance. Composing was about architecture. Finding the order in which the truths could be placed so that each one could bear the weight of the next. The thing he had not told her yet was larger than Tae-hyun. It was the reason Tae-hyun had felt bold enough to threaten anything at all. It was the reason Min-jae had been able to handle him without violence and without exposure. It was the reason for the last 23 months of his life. The carefully managed dismantling of everything he'd spent a decade building. The slow surrender of power that he'd conducted like a man diffusing a device that was also, somehow, himself. He had a name for it now. A formal name used by the people he met with in unmarked offices in the basement of a building near the Mapo district. They called it a cooperation agreement. He called it the thing that would either save his life or end it. He told her the next afternoon. He'd spent the morning doing what he'd done the day before, cooking, showing up, making the space between them feel like something that could be inhabited rather than endured. He'd brought her food she hadn't asked for and left it without expectation. He'd sat with her for 40 minutes on the guest house porch while she read and said almost nothing, and the almost nothing had been, in its way, more honest than most of the conversations they'd had in 2 years. At 2 in the afternoon, she put down her book and looked at him and said, "Tell me the rest." He told her about the investigator first. The initial contact 14 months ago, a man in a gray coat in a parking structure in Mapo, which was so deeply unoriginal that Min-jae had almost laughed. The offer, cooperation in exchange for prosecutorial consideration. His organization dismantled from within. Enough information to end not just his own operation, but 4 connected networks across South Korea and into Japan. He told her he'd said yes. Nia didn't move while he talked. She sat with her hands around a cup of barley tea, and her face entirely composed and her eyes doing the thing they did when she was processing. Not blank, but internal, the arithmetic running behind the stillness. "You've been cooperating with law enforcement for almost 2 years, she said. "Yes." "While still running the organization?" "Carefully, yes. And nobody knows. 3 people know. The investigator, his supervising officer, and now you." She looked at the middle distance for a moment. "Why?" He understood what she was asking. Not the procedural why, but the real one. Why trade the empire? Why risk the exposure? Why surrender what had taken a decade to build? "Because I wanted out," he said, "and because I wanted to be able to look at you one day and not be what I was." He paused. "I know that sounds—" "Don't finish that sentence with an apology," she said. He stopped. "I need to understand the timeline," she said. "You started cooperating 14 months ago. We'd been married, 18 months at that point? 20. So 4 months into our marriage falling apart, you decided to blow up your own organization." "Yes. That's not nothing, Min-jae." "I know. That's not a man who stopped caring." Her voice had shifted slightly. Not softened, but recalibrated, the way a measuring instrument adjusts when it encounters something larger than its previous range. "It was supposed to be the beginning of something different," he said. "I thought if I could get clean, if I could end it the right way, the way that didn't leave bodies or loose ends, I could come back to you with something real, something I wasn't ashamed of, and instead I filed for divorce first." "Yes." She set down the cup. She stood up and walked to the window and stood there with her back to him, looking out at the winter garden. The skeletal trees, the gray flagstone path, the low November sky pressing down on everything. "I'm angry," she said. "I want to be clear about that. I'm not... This doesn't fix it. You telling me the truth now doesn't undo 2 years of me sitting in that house feeling like I was going out of my mind." "I know." "Stop saying I know." She turned from the window. "Say something that isn't just confirmation that you're receiving what I'm transmitting. Say something actual." He looked at her. I was afraid, he said. Not of Tae-hyun, not of the investigator or the exposure or what cooperation could cost me. I was afraid that if I came to you and told you what I was trying to do, that I was trying to get out, that I was trying to become someone who deserved you, you'd look at me the way you're looking at me right now, and I'd see you do the math and come up short. She stared at him. So I said nothing, he said, and I kept working. And I told myself you were safe, and that was enough. And the whole time I was telling myself that you were in the next room deciding you were done. He breathed out. I was so afraid of you seeing me clearly that I made it impossible for you to see me at all. The room was very quiet. Nia turned back to the window. He watched the line of her shoulders, the tension in them, the weight. He watched her breathe. He did not go to her. He had learned in the past 48 hours that the most important thing he could offer her was the choice of whether to close the distance herself. After a long moment, she said, "Show me the countryside house." He blinked. "What?" "You mentioned it, in the dossier." He'd given her a folder 2 days ago. Bank records, property documents, the full financial picture he'd promised her. "There's a property outside the city. You purchased it 8 months ago." She turned to look at him. "Show me." "Now?" "Tomorrow," she said. "Take me there tomorrow." He nodded slowly. "Okay." She turned back to the window. Outside, the light was fading, the gray afternoon collapsing into early dark, the garden going blue and still. "Min-jae?" "Yes." "The investigator," she said. "Is it finished? The cooperation? Is it done?" And here was the place he had known he would reach, the edge of the thing he had not yet told her because it had not yet happened, the piece of the truth that was not past tense but present, not what he had done, but what he was still obligated to do. He thought about the meeting scheduled for 4 days from now, the final operation, the name he'd been given by the investigator last week, Jung-seok-jin, a name he hadn't spoken aloud yet because saying it would make it real, and making it real meant admitting to Nia that it was not, in fact, over. He opened his mouth. His phone buzzed. He looked at the screen. The number was one he recognized. The gray coat investigator's private line, used only when something had changed. He looked up at Nia. She was watching him with an expression that told him she had seen the shift in his face and was already calculating what it meant. "You need to answer that," she said. It wasn't a question. He answered it. He listened for 45 seconds without speaking. He kept his face still with the practiced effort of a man who had spent years keeping his face still in rooms where showing anything was dangerous. He said 2 words, "I understand," and ended the call. Nia was looking at him. "It's not finished," she said. He put the phone in his pocket. He looked at her, at the woman he had almost lost twice now, standing in the fading light of a room that was too small for everything they were carrying, and he said the only honest thing left. "There's one more thing I have to do," he said, "and I need you to hear about it before you find out another way." Outside, the last of the daylight dissolved into dark, and somewhere in the city, a man named Jung-seok-jin was making plans of his own. And the clock that had been running since Christmas Eve was running faster now, and the 14 days they had been given were suddenly not 14 days at all. They were 4. He told her about Seok-jin that night, not all of it, not because he was protecting himself. He was done protecting himself. That particular habit had cost him everything it was going to cost him, and he was not going to let it take anything else. He told her what he knew. Jung Seok-jin, younger brother of Jung Tae-hyun, 34 years old, former military, currently running what remained of the fractured network that Min-jae's cooperation had spent 14 months systematically dismantling. He told her that Seok-jin had surfaced 3 weeks ago, that the investigator had been tracking his movements, and that the phone call tonight meant the timeline had accelerated. Seok-jin wanted a meeting, not a confrontation, a meeting. That was the word the investigator had used, and Min-jae had understood immediately what it meant and what it didn't mean. In the world he came from, a meeting requested under those circumstances was never just a meeting. It was an ultimatum delivered in person. It was a man who had lost everything deciding to make that loss symmetrical. Nia stood in the middle of the guest house living room and listened to all of it without interrupting. Her arms were crossed. Not defensively, he'd learned to read the difference, but the way she crossed them when she was containing something large and needed the physical boundary to hold it. When he finished, she said, "He blames you for his brother." "Yes." "Does he know about me?" The question landed with the specific weight of a question whose answer you already suspect. "Possibly," Min-jae said. "The investigator believes Seok-jin has been running his own surveillance. What he knows exactly. We don't have that yet." She uncrossed her arms. She looked at him with an expression that was not fear. Nia did not perform fear. She converted it directly into something harder and more functional, but something adjacent to it. The recognition of a threat that had a face now. "What does the investigator want you to do?" she said. "Attend the meeting, wear a wire, give them what they need to make an arrest that sticks. And if something goes wrong, there will be officers in position." "That's not what I asked." He held her gaze. "If something goes wrong, there are officers in position." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Go back to the house, Min-jae. I need to think." He went. She came to him the next morning. He was in the kitchen. He'd been in the kitchen every morning. It had become the place where he stationed himself because it was the room she had to pass through if she came in from the guest house side, and he was not going to miss her if she came. He was standing at the stove, and she walked in without knocking, still in her coat from outside, her breath just barely visible in the air because the morning was cold enough that the warmth of the kitchen hadn't fully reached the door yet. She said, "Show me the countryside house today, like we planned." He turned from the stove. "After what I told you last night, especially after what you told you last night," she said. "Show me." They drove out of Seoul in the early morning, through the thin winter traffic of a city not yet fully awake, and onto the highway that wound northeast through hills that had gone brown and silver with the cold. Min-jae drove. Nia sat in the passenger seat with her hands in her coat pockets and watched the landscape change, the city releasing its grip slowly, the buildings thinning, the sky opening up above the hills in a flat, pale gray that had a kind of austere beauty if you were in the right state of mind for it. She wasn't sure she was, but she was trying. The house was 40 minutes outside the city, at the end of a gravel road that cut through a stand of bare birch trees and opened suddenly onto a low hill with a view across a valley. The house itself was not large, nothing like the Seoul mansion, nothing designed to impress, but it sat in its landscape like it had been placed there by someone who understood both the house and the land. Stone exterior, wide windows, a porch facing the valley, a garden that had gone to seed for the winter but had the bones of something intentional. Min-jae pulled up to the front and stopped the car and did not say anything. He was learning, slowly, incompletely, when not to talk. Nia got out of the car and stood on the gravel and looked at the house for a long time. "When did you buy it?" she said. 8 months ago. Before you knew about the pregnancy. Long before. She walked toward this front door. He followed a half step behind. He unlocked the door and pushed it open, and she walked in first, and he watched her move through the empty rooms. The living room with the wide windows and the valley view, the kitchen that was smaller and more human than anything in the Seoul house, the hallway with the bare wood floors, and he watched her face. She stopped in the doorway of one room. She stood there without going in. He came up beside her. The room was small. It had a window that faced the hill. Someone had painted the walls a warm, soft color. Not white, not yellow, something in between. And in the corner, there was a wooden crib, assembled, undecorated, waiting. Nia looked at the crib for a long time. "You built it," she said. "I built it. Before you knew." "Before I knew." He paused. "I think some part of me knew. Before it was a fact. I think I was already planning for it, and I didn't know how to tell you that either." She stepped into the room. She walked to the crib and put her hand on the railing, just rested it there, not gripping, just the warmth of her palm against the wood. She stood like that for a moment with her back to him, and he stood in the doorway and gave her the room. When she turned around, her eyes were wet. She didn't apologize for it, and he didn't comment on it. "I'm still angry," she said. "I know, but I believe you," she said. "I hate that I believe you, because it would be so much simpler not to, but I do." He didn't move. He didn't go to her. He stood in the doorway with his hands at his sides and let it be what it was. "Don't make me regret that," she said. "I won't," he said. "I will spend whatever time I have left making sure you don't." The meeting with Seok Jin was scheduled for the following evening. The investigator's name was Park Sung-il. Min Jae had never used his name aloud before, not to anyone, and saying it to Nia the next afternoon felt like pulling something from a locked compartment he had not opened in over a year. Park Sung-il, 47, 20 years with the Korean National Police Agency, the kind of man who wore the same gray coat in every weather as a form of camouflage. He had come to the estate that afternoon at Min Jae's request. Nia's request, technically. She had said she wanted to meet him, and Min Jae had called before he could overthink the implications. Park sat in the main house living room with his coat still on and his hands around a cup of tea. He wasn't drinking, and he looked at Nia Okafor across the coffee table with the careful, assessing quality of a man who had spent 20 years reading rooms. Nia looked back at him with equal quality. "How long has he been cooperating?" she said. Not to Min Jae, to Park. 23 months, Park said. "What did he give you?" Park glanced at Min Jae once, a brief professional check, and Min Jae gave a slight nod. 4 operational networks, Park said, dismantled over the course of 18 months, 31 arrests, asset seizures totaling approximately 260 billion to won, and the testimony necessary to sustain prosecution on most of it. He paused. He gave us enough to end a significant portion of what he spent 10 years building. Nia was quiet. "What does he get in return?" she said. "Prosecutorial consideration. Limited immunity for his own prior conduct, with conditions. A clean record, provided the cooperation is completed and the conditions are met." "What are the conditions?" "Full testimony if required, and the completion of one final operation." Park's voice did not change register. The Seok-jin meeting. Nia turned to look at Min Jae. He held the look. "Without this meeting," Park said, "Seok-jin remains operational. He's the last significant loose end. If he's not arrested on an evidentiary basis, something that holds up, he surfaces again in 6 months with a different name and the same intentions." He stopped. "His stated intentions, as we understand them, include making Min Jae an example." "An example," Nia said. "He lost his brother's organization and his brother's future in a single month. He blames Min Jae entirely. Our intelligence suggests he's been building toward a confrontation for 3 months. And your plan is to put my husband in a room with him." "Our plan," Park said carefully, "is to put your husband in a supervised position where Seok-jin comes to him and to have sufficient personnel in place to ensure that the meeting ends with an arrest rather than anything else." Nia looked at the investigator. "How many times in your career has a plan like that gone exactly as designed?" Park was quiet for a moment. It was the most honest moment of the entire meeting. "Ms. Okafor," he said, "I won't tell you there's no risk. There is risk. What I can tell you is that Min Jae has operated under risk for 23 months and conducted himself in a way that has consistently protected both the operation and himself. He is very good at what he does, even when what he's doing is its own undoing." Nia stood up. She looked at Min Jae. She looked at him the way she had looked at the crib, with something that was not quite tenderness and not quite grief, but lived in the territory between them. "Give us a minute," she said to Park. Park picked up his tea and looked at the window. Nia walked to the far end of the room and Min Jae followed her. She turned to face him and her voice dropped low, not because she was afraid of being heard, but because some conversations reduce themselves by force of gravity to a certain register. "Tell me honestly," she said, "not what you think I want to hear. Do you believe Park can keep you safe?" "I believe Park is competent." "That's not what I asked." He looked at her. "I believe the plan is sound. I believe Seok-jin wants to talk before he does anything because he wants to see me afraid first. That gives us time. That gives the officers time." He paused. "I've been in worse rooms." "You've been in worse rooms when you were the most dangerous person in them," she said. "This is different." "Yes," he said. "It is." She looked at the floor, then back at him. "Come back," she said. Simply that. Not a plea. An instruction. "I will. I mean it. So do I." The meeting was set for a warehouse district in Incheon, not far from the port, the kind of area that had enough legitimate foot traffic to provide cover, but enough empty space to conduct the kind of business that didn't want witnesses. Min-jae arrived in a car he didn't usually drive, enclosed without the wire until the last moment. Park's people fitted it in a parking structure 2 blocks away, quick and professional, a small device taped beneath his left arm that he was already trying not to think about. Park's voice came through a single earpiece, low and steady. "We have 6 positions covered. Seokjin's vehicle arrived 7 minutes ago. 2 men with him that we can confirm, possibly a third inside." "Understood," Min-jae said. He got out of the car. The warehouse door was steel, unlocked, pushed open from the inside by a man Min-jae didn't recognize. Young, thick through the shoulders, the specific blankness of someone employed for presence rather than conversation. Min-jae walked in without being searched, which told him something. Either Seokjin was confident enough not to bother, or he was arrogant enough to consider the gesture unnecessary. Neither was reassuring. The interior was large and mostly empty. Concrete floor, high ceiling, a row of industrial lights throwing harsh white light over a space that had been stripped of whatever it once stored. In the center, in a folding chair with the relaxed posture of a man waiting for a bus, sat Young Seok-jin. He was younger than Min-jae had expected. 34, but looking younger than that. Lean, sharp-featured, with the particular alertness of someone who had spent significant time in environments where alertness was a survival trait. He was dressed plainly. He had his hands in his lap. He looked, Min-jae thought, exactly like his brother, except where Tae-hyun had always carried a quality of contained calculation, Seok-jin carried something raw, something that hadn't been processed yet into patience. Min-jae walked toward him and stopped 8 feet away. Seok-jin looked at him. "You look tired," Seok-jin said. In Korean, which Min-jae matched. "Long week." "Sit down." "I'll stand." Seok-jin looked at him for a moment, taking inventory, the way dangerous men do, the silent catalog. And then he tilted his head slightly and said, "Do you know why I asked for this meeting?" "Tell me." "Because I wanted to look at you." His voice was even. "I wanted to look at the man who handed my brother's life to a government investigator and see what that looked like in the face." He studied Min-jae without blinking. "It looks like exhaustion." "Your brother stole from me," Min-jae said, "and then he threatened my wife." What happened to him was a consequence of his own decisions. Something moved in Seok-jin's face, just below the surface. "My brother built something for you for 6 years, 6 years of loyalty, and you fed him to the police like he was a loose end. He threatened Nia. He was protecting himself." "From me," Min-jae said. "He was protecting himself from the consequences of betraying me. That's not loyalty. That's calculation." Seok-jin stood up. He was slightly shorter than Min-jae, but he stood like the difference didn't register. "Where is she now?" he said. "Your wife." Min-jae's jaw tightened. In his ear, Park's voice. "Hold position. Hold." "That's not a conversation we're having," Min-jae said. "She's at the estate," Seok-jin said. "East end of the property, the guest house." He watched Min-jae's face. "Did you think I didn't do my homework?" The cold that moved through Min-jae was not fear. It was something past fear, something that had already converted itself into a very clear, very narrow focus. He kept his face still. He kept his breathing even. He kept his hands at his sides. "Whatever you think you know about my personal... I know she's pregnant," Seok-jin said. "I know she almost got on a plane to London last week. I know she came back." He let that sit for a moment. "I know exactly what she means to you, which means I know exactly what I have." The man behind Min-jae moved. Min-jae heard it before he felt it, the shift of weight on concrete, the particular sound of someone closing distance with purpose. And then something cold and hard pressed against the back of his skull, just below the ear, and the warehouse went very quiet. Park's voice in his ear, sharp now. "Hold. Do not escalate. We need 30 seconds. 30 seconds. Min-jae stood very still. The barrel of the gun was not shaking. The man holding it was calm, professional. Seok-jin had not come here to be dramatic. He'd come here to negotiate from a position of absolute control, and he had manufactured that position with considerable precision. Seok-jin walked forward until he was 3 feet away. He looked up at Min-jae with a quality in his face that was not hatred. It was something more focused than hatred. It was the expression of a man who had been constructing this moment for months and was now fully inside it. "You took everything from my brother," he said quietly. I'm going to take everything from you. Not quickly, not violently. I'm going to take the woman, the child, the future you've been trying to build in the countryside." He paused. "And you're going to spend the rest of your life knowing that you caused it, the way you caused everything else." Min Jae looked at him. The gun behind his head was still. In his ear, Park's voice had gone silent, which either meant the 30 seconds were up or something had changed that required silence. He breathed. He looked at Seok-jin, at the rage packed inside the composure, at the grief that had been compressed into this particular shape, and he made a decision that was not the decision of the man he used to be. He didn't reach for violence. He didn't calculate an exit. He stood in the cold light of that warehouse with a gun at his head, and he looked at Jung Seok-jin and he said, quietly and without performance, "Your brother made his choices, so did I. So did you. You came here tonight with a plan that ends with you in a prison cell or a body bag, and you already know that, and you're here anyway because you don't know what else to do with what you're carrying." Seok-jin's jaw moved. "I'm not going to fight you," Min Jae said. "I'm not going to run. I'm standing here because the only thing I have left is this, standing in front of you and not being what I was. And you can do whatever you came here to do, but it won't give your brother his life back, and it won't give you yours." The gun at his head didn't move. Seok-jin stared at him. And then the doors came open, all of them, simultaneously, the warehouse flooding with the particular controlled chaos of a tactical entry, voices calling positions, lights, the sound of men hitting the floor, and the gun at Min Jae's head was gone, pulled back by a man already being taken down, and Seok-jin stood in the center of the warehouse with his hands at his sides and watched the walls close in around him. He didn't run. Min Jae noticed that. He stood there and watched it happen with the exhausted calm of a man who had already understood somewhere in the planning of this night that this was how it was going to end. Park's officers had Seok-jin in cuffs inside 90 seconds. Clean, professional, no shots fired. The warehouse filled with the clipped language of procedure and the smell of cold air from the open doors. Park appeared at Min Jae's shoulder. "You all right?" "Yes." "The part where you started giving a speech with a gun at your head, that was not in the plan." "No," Min Jae said. "It wasn't." Park looked at him sideways. "It worked." Min Jae looked across the warehouse at Seok-jin, who was being processed with his face turned away. The line of his back something between defeat and relief. Min Jae felt something that wasn't quite pity, but was in the same family. The recognition of a man destroyed by loyalty to a person who hadn't earned it, the way all the worst grief is. "Is it done?" Min Jae said. "It's done," Park said. "The cooperation agreement is fulfilled. Everything from here is paperwork." He paused. "You're out." Min Jae stood in the cold warehouse light and heard those words land somewhere in his chest where something had been clenched for 3 years and was only now, by degrees, beginning to release. He was out. He pulled out his phone. He called the estate. It rang twice. Nia picked up. "It's done," he said. "I'm coming home." There was a silence on the line that he could not read. Not quite relief, not quite anything he had a clean name for. And then she said, "I'll be up." He walked out of the warehouse and into the cold night air, and the sky above Incheon was black and full of stars that had no interest in what had just happened, indifferent in the way that vast things are indifferent. And he stood by the car for a moment and let the cold move through him and thought about a woman in a guest house keeping a light on. He got in the car. He drove. He drove back through the dark in a particular kind of silence that had nothing to do with quiet. His hands were steady on the wheel. His breathing was even. But somewhere beneath the surface of all that trained composure, something was shaking. Not fear, not relief, but the specific tremor of a man who has been operating at maximum tension for so long that the sudden absence of the threat doesn't feel like safety. It feels like free fall. The estate gates opened at his approach. He pulled into the drive and sat in the car for a moment after cutting the engine, in the dark, with the cold coming in fast through the vents. The guest house light was on. He had told her he was coming home, and she had said she'd be up, and there it was. A pale rectangle in the dark, steady, the way it had been that first morning when he'd stood at the kitchen window and watched it from across the property and told himself it was enough. It had never been enough. He understood that now with a clarity that cost something. He got out of the car. He crossed the property on foot, the flagstone path, the winter-dead garden, the cold that bit at the back of his neck, and knocked twice on the guest house door. She opened it before the second knock was fully landed, which meant she'd been close to the door, which meant she'd been waiting in a way that she probably wouldn't describe as waiting. She looked at him. His face, his hands, the specific quality of a man who has just come out the other side of something. "Come in," she said. He came in. The guest house was warm. She'd had the heat running, the small living room lit by the corner lamp, and a second light in the kitchen. She was wearing a thick sweater over pajamas, and her feet were bare on the wood floor, and her hair was loose, and she was, he thought, the most real thing he had seen in years. She looked him over once, efficiently. "Are you hurt?" "No." "Seokjin." "In custody." "It's done." He paused. Park confirmed. "The agreement is fulfilled." She nodded once. She turned and walked to the kitchen, and he followed. She poured 2 glasses of water without asking. She knew he would be dehydrated. He was always dehydrated when he'd been running on adrenaline, and set one in front of him on the kitchen counter. He drank half of it in one movement. She watched him. "Tell me what happened," she said. He told her. He told her about the warehouse, about Seokjin's composure, and the thing underneath it that was all raw nerve and unprocessed grief. About the gun, he didn't soften that part. He'd promised her no omissions, and he kept it. And about the moment he'd made the choice not to perform and not to calculate, and just to stand there and say the true thing. He told her about Park's team coming through the doors. He told her it was over. She listened to all of it with her hands wrapped around her water glass and her face doing the internal arithmetic he'd come to recognize. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He knew about the guest house." "Yes." "He knew I was pregnant." "Yes." Her jaw tightened slightly. "That's not nothing." "No," he said. "It isn't. But it's over. He's in custody, and Park's people are already moving on anyone connected to him. There's no infrastructure left. There's no one with both the motive and the means to come after us now." She set down the water glass. She looked at him with an expression he couldn't fully categorize. It had layers to it, the way expressions do when they're carrying more than one thing at once. There was exhaustion in it. There was relief, the reluctant kind. There was anger, still, residual, the anger that doesn't go away just because the immediate crisis resolves. And there was something else, something that had been there in the nursery when she'd put her hand on the crib railing, something he didn't want to name too quickly for fear of being wrong about it. "I need to sleep," she said. "Okay, don't go anywhere." She said it flatly, not as a request. "I mean, stay on the property. I need to know you're here." "I'll be in the house." She nodded. She walked him to the door. He stepped out into the cold, and she stood in the doorway behind him, and he turned to look at her. Her in the warm light of the guest house, him in the dark of the winter garden, and for a moment neither of them said anything. "Min-jae," she said. "Yeah." "You could have run in that warehouse. You could have, I don't know how these things work, but you could have fought back or called it off or found an exit." She paused. "You didn't." "No." "Why?" He looked at her. "Because fighting back would have been the old answer, and I'm done with the old answers." She looked at him for one more moment. Then she stepped back and closed the door, and he stood in the cold dark for a breath before turning and walking back to the main house. And the night was very still around him, and somewhere in the city, a man named Jung Seok-jin was sitting in a processing room with his hands in his lap and his future dismantled, and Min-jae walked through his winter garden and felt, for the first time in 3 years, like a man who was walking towards something instead of away from it. The next morning, she came to the main house. Not to the kitchen door, to the front door, knock and all, like a visitor, like someone who was choosing to enter rather than defaulting to it. He opened the door, and she was standing on the step with her coat on and her hair up, and her face composed in the careful way that meant she'd made a decision and was coming to deliver it. "I want to talk," she said. "Come in." She came in. She didn't take off her coat, which told him this was going to be brief and direct. She stood in the entryway and looked at him. "I've been thinking," she said, "about what you said. In the warehouse. What you told me you said to him." "Okay." You said you were standing there because the only thing you had left was not being what you were. She paused. Did you mean that? Every word. Because here's what I need you to understand. She looked at him with the full attention quality he had come to understand was not a gesture, but a demonstration. She brought this to things she was serious about, and she was serious about everything. I'm not interested in a version of you that's performing transformation. I've watched enough people perform change to know what it looks like. It looks convincing. It sounds right. And it lasts until the pressure comes back and the old wiring fires, and suddenly the person you thought you were building something with is gone again. I know. You keep saying that. Because it keeps being true, he said. Nia, I don't have a performance left in me. I'm out of the craft of it. Whatever you're seeing right now is what's left after the craft is gone. She studied him. What does that look like going forward, specifically, not in principle? What does the life actually look like? The businesses I still have that are legitimate, distribution, 2 real estate holdings, a logistics company, I keep those and I clean them properly. The ones that aren't clean, I wind them down. That's going to take time and it's not going to be seamless, but it's underway. He'd been working on this for weeks, quietly, in the margins of everything else. The countryside house. I want us to be there. I want to raise our daughter there. I want to be the person who's home for dinner and present for the mundane things and present for the hard things. That sounds like a plan, she said. I'm asking what it looks like. He understood the distinction. A plan was intellectual. What it looks like was operational, the daily specific texture of an actual life. It looks like breakfast, he said. Like I've been doing this week. It looks like knowing what you need before I need to be told. It looks like never making a decision about your safety or your future without talking to you first, regardless of what I think I know better. He paused. It looks like me in that nursery at 3 a.m, not because I have to be, because I want to be there. Nia was very still. I'm not asking you to forgive everything at once, he said. I'm not asking you to decide today that what we had is repaired. I'm asking you to let the next thing be built instead of trying to restore the last thing. He paused. The last thing was built on me hiding. Whatever comes next has to be built on something else. She looked at him for a long moment. The morning light came through the entryway window and fell across the floor between them, pale and honest. The kind of light that doesn't flatter anything, but doesn't lie either. Take off your coat, she said. He blinked. You look like you're about to give me a speech, she said. Take it off. Sit down. I'll make tea. We're going to talk for a long time, and I don't want either of us standing in the hallway like this is an interview. He took off his coat. Monkeys. They talked for 4 hours. Not about the organization or Seokjin or the cooperation agreement or any of the architecture of the past 2 years. They talked about the marriage, the actual substance of it, the specific things that had corroded and when, the conversations that never happened and should have, the habits each of them had developed that had been, in their different ways, forms of retreat. She talked about New York, about the life she'd been building when they met, about the way she'd set parts of it down to come to Seoul, and how that setting down had never been fully acknowledged. He talked about his father, a man he almost never discussed, about the version of strength he'd learned from him that turned out to be not strength at all, but a very sophisticated form of isolation. They talk the way people talk when they're not performing and not protecting themselves, which is messier and less articulate and more true than most conversations manage to be. At some point, she took off her coat. At some point, he made actual tea, and she didn't comment on the fact that it was better than the first time he'd tried it 4 days ago. At some point, the light in the room changed as the morning moved toward afternoon, and he realized they'd been sitting at the kitchen table for 3 hours, and neither of them had moved to end it. I want to go back to the countryside house, she said. This week. I want to start making it actually ours. We can go tomorrow. And the nursery. She said it without looking away. I want to do it properly. Not just the crib. Actually put it together. Tell me what you want in there and I'll find it. She looked at him. I don't want you to find it. I want us to find it together. That's the point. He held her gaze. The distinction was not lost on him. The difference between providing and participating, between taking care of someone and being present with them. He had confused those things for 3 years. He was not going to confuse them again. Together, he said. She nodded. She picked up her tea. She looked out the kitchen window at the winter garden, at the flagstone path and the bare trees and the guest house at the far end of the property, and he watched the side of her face and thought about the day she'd almost boarded a plane to London and the specific mathematics of how close he had come to missing all of this. This table, this light, this woman who had every reason to be somewhere else and had chosen, against the odds of everything he'd put her through, to still be here. Min-jae, she said. Yeah. She turned to look at him. Her face had something in it that he recognized. Not the composure, not the assessment, but the thing underneath that she showed rarely, and only when she'd decided to trust it. I'm not going to say I forgive you today, she said, because I don't think forgiveness is a moment. I think it's a direction, and I think... She stopped, pressed her lips together briefly. I think I'm facing the right direction. He didn't say anything. He held it. Don't make me turn around, she said. I won't, he said. I will spend every day making sure you don't have to. But 3 days later, they drove to the countryside house together. They spent the morning unpacking the boxes she'd had forwarded from the Seoul estate. Her books, her art catalogs, the specific objects she'd accumulated over years of curating other people's beautiful things that she'd quietly kept for herself. A small bronze figure from a Togolese artist she'd worked with early in her career. A framed lithograph she'd bought at a market in Cape Town. A wooden bowl her grandmother had given her that had lived on every windowsill she'd ever had. He carried boxes. She directed placement with the particular authority of a woman who understood space, and he understood that this was not decoration but possession, the act of a person marking a place as theirs, making it mean something. They went to the nursery last. They'd stopped at a shop on the way out of Seoul, a small place she'd found, not the expensive kind, the kind run by an older woman who made things by hand and had opinions about color. They'd spent 40 minutes in there and left with a mobile of painted wooden birds, a soft rug in warm terracotta, a set of small prints for the wall. Nia had known exactly what she wanted and had been definitive about it, and he had followed her lead without offering opinions she hadn't asked for, and it had felt, unexpectedly, like one of the most intimate things they'd done together. They hung the mobile from the ceiling above the crib. She put the rug down. He hung the prints level. She checked them with her eye and adjusted one slightly, and he held the correction without comment, and she looked at him sideways when she stepped back and something moved in her expression that was close to amusement. You're learning, she said. I'm trying, he said. She looked at the room. The warm walls, the crib, the mobile turning slowly in the air from a vent current, the small prints in their row. A room that had been awaiting emptiness and was now, visibly, a place. She put her hand on her stomach, not the theatrical gesture of a woman performing pregnancy, but the unconscious one of a woman checking in with something real. He watched her do it. He watched her face when she did it, the softness that arrived without invitation, the way it changed the lines of her expression into something he hadn't seen in 2 years and had been afraid he'd never see again. He crossed the room. He stood beside her, close but not touching, and looked at the crib. What do you want for her? He said. What do you mean? I mean, what do you want her to have? The things we didn't. Nia was quiet for a moment. Honesty, she said. I want her to grow up in a house where the truth isn't something people protect each other from. She paused. And I want her to see what it looks like when two people actually choose each other, not just once, every day. He turned to look at her. She turned to look at him. The mobile above the crib turned its slow, patient circle. He reached out and took her hand. Not dramatically. Just that, just his hand around hers, her fingers adjusting to accommodate his. She didn't pull away. She stood there with her hand in his in the room they'd built for their daughter and let the moment be what it was. Outside the window, the valley was gray and bare and winter cold, and the birch trees at the edge of the property stood in their patient rows, and the sky above the hills was the specific pale color of a season that is ending before it's ready to. And it was the most beautiful thing he had seen in his adult life. 4 weeks later, Park Sung-il called. Min-jae was in the countryside kitchen making dinner when the call came. An actual dinner, with actual attention paid to it. The kind of dinner he was still figuring out how to make, but was figuring out, which was the point. Nia was in the living room with a book. The kitchen smelled like garlic, and something scorched that he was pretending was intentional. He answered on the second ring. The prosecution confirmed the charges this morning, Park said. Seokjin and the remaining 2 men from the warehouse. The evidentiary package from your cooperation is being formally submitted next week. The agreement is officially closed. Min-jae stood at the stove with the phone against his ear. Any complications? None we didn't anticipate. The immunity conditions are met. Your prior conduct is covered. Park paused. It's over. Formally, completely, officially, over. Min-jae breathed. There's one more thing, Park said. I've been asked to inform you that a formal recommendation has been submitted from my supervising officer to the prosecutor's office, acknowledging the scope and significance of your cooperation. It won't be public, but it's on record. Another pause, and then in a voice slightly different from his usual register. You gave up a great deal, Min-jae. I don't think that goes unacknowledged. Thank you, Sung-il. He said the man's given name for the first time. Park received it without comment. Good luck, Park said, and hung up. Min-jae set the phone on the counter. He stood in the kitchen in the yellow light with the smell of slightly scorched garlic and the sound of Nia turning a page in the next room, and he pressed both hands flat against the counter and breathed all the way down to the bottom of his lungs for the first time in years. Min-jae, her voice from the living room. Something's burning. He looked at the stove. It's fine, he said. It doesn't smell fine. He turned down the heat and adjusted the pan and called back, Come tell me what's wrong with it. A pause. Then the sound of her setting down her book, her footsteps on the wood floor, the rustle of her coming into the kitchen doorway. She looked at the stove. She looked at him. She crossed her arms and regarded the pan with the measured assessment of a woman who knew exactly what was wrong with it. The heat's too high, she said. I know. You said that about the last one. I'm consistent. She almost smiled. Almost. But the shape of her mouth changed the way it changed when she was working to contain something. She walked to the stove and adjusted the burner herself, and he stepped back to give her room, and she stirred the pan once, and then turned to look at him and saw something in his face. What? She said. Park called, he said. It's done. The case is closed. She looked at him. The kitchen was quiet around them. The low sound of the pan, the wind outside against the windows, the particular stillness of a house in winter at dusk. Say that again, she said. It's done, he said. Everything, formally, officially. There's nothing left. She looked at him for a long moment. He watched her process it, the way the information moved through her, the layers of it, what it meant and what it changed and what it didn't change. She turned back to the stove. She stirred the pan again. Her back was to him, and he couldn't see her face, and he waited. We should eat, she said. Her voice was different, quieter, with something underneath it that needed to be in a room of its own for a moment. Yeah, he said. We should. He set the table. She finished what he'd started on the stove without commenting on the state he'd left it in. They sat across from each other at the small countryside kitchen table in the gathering dark, and the food was imperfect, and the wine she'd switched to barley tea, and he'd switched in solidarity without being asked, and they ate in the easy silence of 2 people who have stopped performing and started simply being. After dinner, she did not go back to her book. She stayed at the table, and he stayed at the table, and they talked. Small things, mostly. The specific small things of a life being built. What the nursery still needed, whether the garden could be salvaged in spring, whether the logistics company required a new operations manager or just a restructured mandate. Ordinary things. The extraordinary ordinariness of a future being constructed in real time. At some point, her hand was on the table between them, and he put his hand over it, and she let him, and outside the winter valley was dark and cold and completely indifferent, and inside the house the light was on. And then, at 11:17 on a Thursday night in a countryside kitchen that still smelled faintly of scorched garlic, Nia Okafor looked at her husband across the remains of an imperfect dinner and said the thing that landed in his chest like something structural finally clicking into place. I want to do the vows again, she said. Not a big thing, not a performance. Just us and the people who actually matter, and something real. She paused. I want to mean them this time, knowing everything. He looked at her. The lamp above the table threw its warm light across her face, and she was looking at him with the full attention quality and nothing behind it that needed decoding. "When?" he said. "When she's born," she said. "When we're on the other side of it. I want to do it with her there." She looked at him steadily. "I want her to be the first witness." He held the moment. He held it carefully, with both hands, the way you hold something you understand the weight of. "Yes," he said. One word. The most complete thing he had ever said. She nodded once. She picked up her tea. She looked out the dark window at the dark valley, and he watched her profile in the lamplight and thought that this specific moment, this woman, this table, this imperfect meal in a house that was becoming theirs, was the thing he had almost destroyed and had somehow, through grace and cost, and the one decision to drive to an airport at midnight, been given back. Not repaired, not restored. Something new. Something that had been built out of the wreckage of the old thing by two people who had both, in their different ways, decided to stay. Outside, the first snow of the season was beginning to fall on the valley. Soft, unhurried, indifferent to everything beneath it. And inside the house, the light was on, and the pan was still warm on the stove, and somewhere above them in the room with the warm walls and the mobile of painted wooden birds, a crib was waiting in the dark for the person who would make all of it finally, irrevocably, mean something. The snow fell for 3 days. Not the dramatic kind. Not the kind that announces itself and demands attention. The quiet kind. The kind that accumulates without fanfare. That covers the valley in increments so gradual you don't notice how deep it's gotten until you step outside and find the world transformed while you weren't watching. Min-jae shoveled the path from the house to the garden each morning before Nia was awake. Not because she would have gone out in it, but because doing it felt necessary. The specific necessity of a man who needs to be useful in the small ways because the large ways have for now been exhausted. She watched him from the kitchen window the first morning. He didn't know she was watching. She stood with her tea and observed the particular quality of his attention to the task. The methodical passes, the care taken at the edges, the way he stopped once and looked up at the hill as though checking something he couldn't name. She had spent 3 years trying to read this man through walls he'd constructed with professional precision, and she was only now, in the aftermath of everything, learning that what she'd been trying to see had always been visible. She'd just been looking in the wrong register. She went back to the table and sat down with her tea and her hand on the small, insistent weight of their daughter, who had developed a habit of moving in the early mornings and let the feeling of the house settle around her. It was a different kind of quiet than the Seoul mansion. That house had been quiet the way expensive things are quiet. The silence of surfaces that have been designed not to echo. This house was quiet the way inhabited things are quiet. The quiet of wood and winter and two people learning a different pace. She was 31 weeks. Her body had opinions about this that she had not fully anticipated. Not pain, not yet, but the specific insistence of a physical reality that had its own logic and would not be reasoned with. She tired earlier than she wanted to. She woke at 3 in the morning for no reason that she could identify. She had developed an irrational intensity of feeling about certain things. The wooden bowl from her grandmother on the kitchen windowsill, the specific way the valley looked in the hour before full dark, that she recognized as not entirely her own. Min-jae had read 3 books about pregnancy. She had not asked him to. She'd found them stacked on his desk one evening. Actual physical books, annotated in his handwriting in the margins, specific pages marked with small paper clips. She'd stood there and looked at them and felt something shift in her that she hadn't expected to shift yet. Something that had been held in suspension since the night at the airport, waiting for enough evidence to land. She didn't say anything to him about the books. She didn't need to. The vow renewal ceremony happened on a Saturday in late February, 3 weeks before her due date. Nia had insisted on small, and by small she had meant it, which meant that when Min-jae had instinctively begun to suggest a venue, she had looked at him with a single, calibrated expression, and he had stopped suggesting and started listening. The ceremony was at the countryside house, beside the lake at the bottom of the property's east slope, in the late afternoon of a day that had started cold and clarified as it went, the sky pulling itself into a clean, pale blue by noon. There were 11 people. Her mother, who had flown in from London and spent the first 20 minutes regarding Min-jae with the specific assessment of a woman who had watched her daughter go through 2 years of quiet dissolution and was withholding final judgment. His younger sister, the only member of his family he still had anything resembling a relationship with, who had driven up from Seoul and cried before the ceremony started and pretended she hadn't. Park Sung-il, who stood at the edge of the group in his gray coat and looked like he was on surveillance, which was perhaps just the only mode he had. A handful of others, Nia's closest friend from her Seoul curatorial years, 2 colleagues, 2 people from his side who had stayed clean through all of it, and whom he trusted in the specific, limited way he trusted anyone. There was no officiant in any formal sense. They had decided on this together. Nia had written what she wanted to say, and Min Jae had written what he wanted to say, and they would say them to each other beside the lake in front of the people who had earned the right to witness it. Nia wore a dress the color of deep winter water. Not white, not bridal in any conventional sense, but a blue-gray that suited the light and the landscape and her particular way of existing in a room as though she had always been the most necessary thing in it. She wore her hair up, and she wore the small gold earrings she'd bought herself on the day she passed her curatorial board certification 7 years ago, because they were the object that most represented to her, the person she'd built before anyone else got to weigh in on the blueprints. She walked down to the lake on her own. Min Jae stood at the water's edge and watched her come. He was wearing dark gray, no tie, no performance of formality. And his hands were at his sides, and his face had the quality she had come to recognize as him stripped of everything practiced. Not vulnerable in the way that needs protection, but vulnerable in the way that simply is what it is. The way a landscape is what it is, not asking for anything in response. Her mother was beside her briefly, a hand on her arm, a look exchanged that had 31 years of history in it. And then Nia was walking the last few yards alone, through the dead winter grass beside the frozen edge of the lake, toward the man she had married once in a ceremony that had been, in its way, a performance of certainty they hadn't yet earned. She stopped in front of him. He looked at her, just that, looked at her with everything available, without editing it. "You go first," she said. He breathed in. He didn't look at what he'd written. He knew it. He'd known it for days. But the knowing wasn't the point. The point was saying it in front of the people and the lake and the cold winter air with nothing between him and the words. "I married you the first time," he said, believing that loving you meant protecting you from everything, including myself. I thought that was a form of devotion. I was wrong. It was a form of control. It was me deciding what you could handle and what you should know and what version of me you deserved, and making all of those decisions without you. He paused. His voice was steady. Not performatively steady. Just a man who had spent weeks sitting with what he needed to say until the emotion of it had been replaced by the fact of it. "I cost us 2 years. I cost you 2 years, and I will spend the rest of my life being present for the years that follow. Not trying to make up for what's gone, because that math doesn't work. But showing up for what's here, telling you the truth when the truth is hard, asking you what you need instead of deciding what you need. Being someone our daughter doesn't have to decode." He stopped. He looked at her steadily. "I choose you knowing everything now, not the version of you I needed you to be. You, this, what's here." Nia was quiet for a moment. Behind her, she heard her mother make a sound that her mother would later categorize as clearing her throat. She looked at Min Jae. She looked at the man she had almost left, the man who had stood in an airport at midnight with a pregnancy test in his hand and said 2 weeks with the specific desperation of a person who has run out of strategy and landed on honesty. The man who had cooked breakfast and driven her to a nursery he'd built before he knew she was pregnant and stood in a warehouse with a gun at his head and refused to be what he used to be. She looked at all of it. "I spent 2 years," she said, "thinking I had failed at something, that I had somehow been insufficient for a version of this that worked. I know now that wasn't true. But I also know," she paused, "I know that I made myself smaller than I was to fit inside what I thought you needed from me. I stopped asking questions because asking felt like weakness. I stopped pushing because pushing felt like desperation." She held his gaze. "I don't know how to be smaller than I am. I tried. And it didn't work, and I'm not going to try again." She let that land for a moment. "I'm choosing you, knowing that it won't be easy, knowing that we are 2 people who know exactly how to disappoint each other, knowing that what we're building is not the thing we started with, but something harder and more specific and, I think, more real. Her hand moved to her stomach briefly, the unconscious gesture. I choose you. Not because you earned it cleanly, because the work you did to try to earn it tells me who you're deciding to be. And I want to be there while you keep deciding. The lake was very still behind them. The pale February sky held everything without comment. He took her hands. She let him. There were no rings. They'd kept their original rings because replacing them would have been a performance of erasure, and they were not trying to erase anything. They were trying to build on top of the rubble, which is harder and messier and more honest than starting clean. Her mother was openly crying. Park Sung-gil was looking at the middle distance with the expression of a man who was experiencing something and had no protocol for it. Min-jae's sister had given up pretending entirely. He leaned forward and she let him, and he put his forehead briefly against hers, and the cold air moved around them, and the lake held its reflection of the winter sky, and the 11 people standing on that hill were quiet in the particular way that people are quiet when they understand they are witnessing something real. Kang Ji-eun was born on a Tuesday in mid-March at a hospital 20 minutes from the countryside house at 4:17 in the morning. She was healthy. She was loud about it. She arrived with the specific vigor of a person who had strong opinions about existing and was going to make them known from the outset. And the first thing Nia said when they placed the baby on her chest was not something beautiful. It was a short, breathless profanity delivered in a tone of absolute awe. And Min-jae, standing at her shoulder with his hand on her back, made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was in the same neighborhood. And the nurse looked up with an expression that suggested she'd heard worse. He had been there for all of it. He had not left the room. He had held Nia's hand for the parts that required it, and stepped back for the parts that required that, and done both without being asked, which was the whole of what she had needed from him, and which he had, after considerable internal reorganization, managed to provide. By the time Ji-eun arrived, he was white-knuckled and wrecked in the specific way of someone who has witnessed something they have no frame of reference for, and are grateful to be without a frame of reference for, because some things should remain uncontainable. He held his daughter for the first time at 4:45 in the morning. The nurse passed her to him with the practiced ease of someone who does this every day and understands that it never gets ordinary for the people receiving it. He took her, this small, declarative, astonishing fact, and held her against his chest and looked at her face. She had Nia's forehead. She had something in the set of her expression that he did not recognize from either of them, and understood must be entirely her own. He stood in the pale hospital light, with his daughter in his arms, and felt something move through him that he did not try to name or contain or process into something manageable. He just let it be what it was. The room around him went soft at the edges. Nia was watching him from the bed, tired, wrecked, present, the most alive he'd ever seen her. And he looked up from Ji-eun's face and met her eyes across the room. She said, "Well." He said, "Yeah." That was enough. That was everything. The spring came the way it comes to that valley. Gradually and then suddenly, the hills going from brown to green in a succession of quiet changes that accumulated into transformation. The birch trees in front of the house put out their first leaves. The garden, which Nia had begun planning in February with the focused intensity of someone who had identified her next project, started to show the results of that planning in small, specific ways. A row of something green at the edge of the flagstone, a climbing thing beginning its work on the porch railing. Ji-eun was 6 weeks old and already had opinions about the mobile above her crib, which she communicated through a combination of focused staring and intermittent commentary. Min-jae had not slept more than 4 consecutive hours in 6 weeks. He did not mention this. He had taken on the 3 a.m. shift by default and by choice. Nia was feeding, Nia was recovering, Nia needed the sleep in longer blocks than he did, and he had told her this in practical terms, and she had accepted it in practical terms, and they had both understood it was also something else. The 3 a.m. hours were their own specific country. He sat in the nursing chair in the nursery with Ji-eun against his chest, and the mobile turning its slow circle above them and the valley dark outside the window. And he was more awake in those hours than he had been in the middle of the day for years. He had begun the process of restructuring his legitimate businesses in earnest. The logistics company had a new operations director, a woman he'd recruited from a freight firm in Busan, competent and clean, who had no knowledge of the organization's history and no interest in acquiring any. The real estate holdings were being reviewed by a law firm that Park had recommended, one that specialized in corporate compliance, and the process was going to take time and cost money and involve a great deal of documentation, which was fine. Documentation meant legitimacy. Legitimacy meant Ji-eun could grow up without a particular kind of shadow. The criminal elements, what remained of them, the tail end of things, the last few threads, had been wound down through the winter, quietly, without incident. Former members had been given options, resources for retraining, connections to legitimate employment, the kind of quiet structural assistance that cost Min-jae something real and which he gave without keeping account of it. 3 men had taken the options seriously and were already elsewhere, rebuilding. Others had gone their own way. He had not tried to manage what he couldn't manage. He had done what he could do and closed the book on what he couldn't. It was not a clean ending. He had long since stopped expecting clean endings. What he had instead was a true one, a line drawn in the specific place where he had decided to stop, held without negotiation. But in late April, Nia went back to work. Part-time, remote, a consulting arrangement with a gallery in Seoul that had been asking for years, and which she had, years ago, declined in the way you decline things when you're trying to fit yourself into someone else's shape. She worked 3 mornings a week at the kitchen table with Ji-eun sleeping in the bassinet beside her, and on the morning she worked, Min-jae took Ji-eun for the hours she needed and did not interrupt unless interrupted first. He had learned, incompletely but genuinely, what giving someone their space actually required. It was not absence. It was the specific attentiveness of a person who was present without demanding to be noticed, available without being a weight, nearby without occupying the room. He was still learning the calibration. Some days he got it wrong. On the days he got it wrong, she told him, and he adjusted without argument, and the adjustment was its own small proof of something. She called her mother every Sunday. He had started calling his sister once a week, a habit that had begun during the worst of the winter and continued past it because it turned out that his sister was sharp and funny and knew him in a way that most people in his life never had, and that he had forfeited access to that for years out of a shame he could now, slowly, put down. One Sunday evening, Nia was on her call with her mother in the living room, and Min-jae was in the kitchen, and Ji-eun was in the bassinet near the window with the early spring light falling across her. And he stood at the counter cutting vegetables with no particular urgency and listened to the sound of Nia laughing at something her mother said. A real laugh, unguarded. The laugh she had when she wasn't thinking about whether to laugh. And he set down the knife and stood there in the kitchen and let the sound of it move through him. He had been listening to that laugh for 3 years. He had heard it less and less as the marriage corroded, and he had told himself at the time that it was just the natural settling of things, the way early happiness gives way to quieter states, and he had believed that because believing it was easier than understanding what he was doing to her. Now he knew what it actually sounded like when it came back. It sounded like something that had not been destroyed after all. It sounded like a fact. The saucy. Christmas came again. It had been 1 year since the marble counter and the divorce papers and the pregnancy test resting on top of them, like a question that couldn't be asked any other way. 1 year since a car to the airport, a departure gate, a man in a suit standing 6 feet away holding a pregnancy test in a terminal full of strangers. 1 year since 2 weeks, the most reckless promise and the most important one. Jian was 9 months old and sitting up on her own and deeply interested in the lights on the tree, which she regarded with the focused intensity of a small person encountering beauty for the first time and having no category for it yet. Min-jae had put the tree up himself, had bought it, transported it, set it in the corner of the living room and spent an evening decorating it, while Ji-eun sat in her bouncer and watched with that expression of total seriousness that she brought to new information. Nia had come downstairs halfway through and stood in the doorway and looked at the scene. Her husband on his knees stringing lights around a tree in the lamplight, their daughter watching him with concentrated gravity. And she had not said anything for a long time. She had gone to the kitchen and made tea and brought him a cup without being asked, and set it on the floor beside him, and sat down on the sofa nearby and opened her book. He had finished the lights and turned to look at her, and she had looked up from the book, and neither of them had needed to name what was in the room. On Christmas Eve, they put Ji-eun down at 7:30 and sat in the living room with the tree lights on and the valley dark outside. And Nia had her tea and Min-jae had his, and the house had the particular quality of fullness that empty houses don't have. The accumulated weight of people who actually live in a place and have left the marks of their living on it. I keep thinking about last year, Nia said. I know. Not in a bad way, she said. Just, I keep thinking about sitting in that gate and seeing you walk up. You were still in your suit. She looked at the tree. You had the test in your hand. You didn't even realize you were still holding it. He looked at his hands. He hadn't thought about that detail in months. I didn't know what else to do with it. That's what I keep thinking about, she said. You're this person who always knows what to do, and you were standing there holding a pregnancy test in an airport like you'd completely run out of calculation. She paused. That was the first time in 2 years I saw you. He looked at her. I was terrified. I know, she said. That's what I mean. They sat with that for a moment. The tree lights made the room warm in the specific way that light from that angle does. The same angle, he thought, as the guest house window that first morning, the pale rectangle he'd watched from the kitchen and told himself was enough. It hadn't been enough. This was enough. The distinction between those two things was the whole of the past year. I've been thinking about the Tate offer, she said. He looked at her. Not the full-time position. They have a consulting project, a collection review, about 8 months of work. It would require some travel, Seoul, a few trips to London. She looked at him. I'd like to take it. Then take it. I'm telling you, not asking for permission. I know, he said. I'm not giving permission. I'm saying take it. It's yours. She looked at him steadily. Something in her face settled. I'll need you to be the steady variable when I'm traveling, she said. Ji-eun's routine, the house. I need to know that doesn't fall apart. It won't. I need you to actually, Nia. His voice was quiet and direct. It won't fall apart. I will be here. I will be present. Ji-eun will be fine, and the house will be here. And when you come back from London or Seoul or wherever, everything will be where you left it. He paused. And I'll have made dinner, probably imperfectly. She almost smiled. The shape of her mouth shifted. Just barely. Just enough. Probably, she said. He reached across the sofa and she put her hand in his without turning to look. A gesture so practiced and unconsidered that it had the quality of something built rather than performed. The reflex of two people who have made a habit of each other. Outside, the valley was dark and still, and the first small snowfall of winter was beginning. Soft, unhurried, drifting through the lamplight outside the window with total indifference to anything beneath it. Ji-eun was upstairs in her room under the mobile of painted wooden birds, breathing in the long, even rhythm of a child who has no cause yet to sleep any other way. The nursery light was off, the house was warm. Min-jae looked at the snow. Last year, he said, when I drove to the airport, I didn't have a plan. I want you to know that. I had nothing. I had your name and the keys and 40 minutes of highway. He paused. I think about what would have happened if you'd gotten on the plane anyway. I almost did, she said. I know. I had my boarding pass out. She looked at the window, at the snow. I was going to go, and then I thought, he drove here. He actually drove here. She paused. It wasn't enough by itself, but it was something. It was something real after 2 years of almost nothing. I should have given you something real long before the airport. Yes, she said. You should have. She said it without softening it, because that was who she was. A woman who would not perform forgiveness that wasn't complete, and whose forgiveness, when it arrived as a fact rather than a gesture. He accepted it as a fact. But you did eventually, she said. That counts. They sat in the quiet of the house, in the warm light of a Christmas Eve that was nothing like the one before it, and everything like what the one before it had been trying badly to contain the potential for. Outside, the snow fell on the valley, and the hills and the birch trees and the lake at the bottom of the east slope where they had stood 4 months ago and said the things that needed to be said. At some point, Nia's head was on his shoulder. He didn't register the exact moment it happened. She had moved incrementally, the way she did most things, with intention that didn't announce itself. He sat very still so as not to disturb it. Ji-eun, upstairs in the warm dark of her room, stirred once and settled. The mobile turned its slow, patient circle above the empty crib. The snow kept falling outside, quiet and steady, covering everything that had happened in the past year under a layer that was not erasure, but accumulation. The way time works when it's working correctly, not erasing what came before, but building on top of it, depth by depth, until the landscape looks like something it couldn't have been at the beginning. Min-jae sat in his house in winter with his wife's head on his shoulder and his daughter asleep above them, and the snow falling outside. And he thought about the airport, and the marble counter, and the cold guest house light that first terrible morning, and the warehouse floor, and the lake in February, and the hospital room at 4:17 in the morning, when a small, loud person arrived and rearranged everything that had already been rearranged. And he thought that none of it, none of the cost, or the loss, size, or the 2 years of silence, or the long work of the year after, none of it had been nothing. All of it had been the material. You don't build the real thing until the first thing breaks. He understood that now. Not as consolation, not as justification, but as fact. The true thing required the whole architecture of everything that preceded it, including the worst of it. He looked at the snow. He stayed where he was. He did not move until Nia fell asleep against him, and then he stayed still a while longer, and the house held them both in its winter quiet. And somewhere in the valley, the lake sat cold and flat and patient under its new cover of snow, waiting, as it always had, for spring.